Welcome to the Wayne Arts Center. We're delighted to see all of you here this afternoon for our Jurors Talk, for craft forms, and also for making marks.
There were no disappointment with this exhibition. When I walked in yesterday, everything that I saw in the show delivered exactly what I had perceived through the screen. So I was very pleased with that. And I agree with Nancy and with all of you who came last night. The show looks great. And I hope you will agree with me. It looks even better in the natural light. Ultimately, the awards were given on this ability of the craft to express the form and also to riff on the form in a very intimate way with the body, whether it was the body of the artist that had engaged in the process or was the relationship between the material and the body, whether mine as a viewer or the artist. So that was really what I was looking for. There are several pieces in the show that are really kind of strong statements of perfection and excellence. Ultimately, they were delivered for me to a different level, very much about being a beautiful image rather than being something intimate, and so I decided not to award them, to be true to really who I am as a practicing curator. That's what I decided to do. So there is no aesthetic judgment, just my own preference. And since I have that privilege by being chosen as the juror, I took advantage of it. Okay.
To convey these emotions within these experiences, I sought to use speed and fluidity, very lyrical approach to the material. And as well, if we think of iron or steel or of metal, we think of heavy or clunky, and that's something I wanted to avoid very much. And so I sought to make it airy and as quick as possible, which is conveyed through material changes, the curves, and then this long element with the chrome on the very end, harkening motorcycles and jet fighters and such.
Functions of the curves where they meet are flowing. So I picked the matte black because the matte black doesn't reflect and it doesn't create shadows. So they all contain 4 drawers. These are the study models initially of what these shapes were going to be.
It's actually one sheet of paper that is folded in 2, and then I use tiny little nail scissors that are curved. And I cut, first I draw, so the paper is white on one side, is black on the other side, and then I draw my image on one side, and then I cut what I want to be symmetrical, then I open it, and what is not symmetrical is cut when it's open. And what I did, I took artists from each continent and put them in. So there's an African basket maker, there's a Japanese, there is a Palestinian glass blower. So you have to really go into detail, and the 21 symbols might be a bit tricky to find, but they're there.
So my chair is called a square or circle. So why it's called that? Because I use certain elements here. So for example, I have several circles. So I use this circle to represent Eastern culture, especially for China, because in common philosophy in China, it's taught us never say something. I also use some shape like this or hard edge to represent Western culture, especially for US. And I also use this rope to hold the whole pieces together. For meaning, this rope can tie the 2 cultures together. Yeah.
The thing that I like to start with when I talk about my piece, aside from the openings and the closings I limit my palette because I love the light to work on it. And inside the core is clothesline. And I work with unbleached linen. And it's not a soft piece, it just looks it. It's very hard. So I always like to work with that sort of give and take.
And he works with a pyrography pen, which is basically a fire pen, and you draw on it with heat and burn the image into it.
We try and talk about what we want. We'll throw all them ideas in and hope we understand each other, sort of. And then I go from there, and then Mike will get it and add something. So it does change as you get it from the other person. That's working really nice.
Michael did the piercing and the edge work. He did the brutalist pyrography on this side, and then I did the interior pyrography and all the edge work and all the color.
Wow, beautiful piece.
Thank you.
My work is very much about the relationship between your internal self and the external world. And in all of my work, but in this work in particular, it was about starting with a very concrete pattern and letting go. And as the artist said before, listening to the piece as it continues to grow. The contrast of the hard and the soft also reflects back to what goes on inside of us.
So I just kind of, one piece at a time, build it, glue it, and after you get to that point, then the fun part comes in when you get your power tools out and start carving and refining the curves.
I started turning without really having much of an intention. I took these amazing pieces of wood and put them on the lathe and started turning them. After a while, I discovered that a certain idea was coming through, and that was that these started to look like pieces that were salvaged from an architectural dig. And I worked towards this idea of classic forms. I had an intuitional flash one day about a bleached cow skull out in the middle of the desert in Texas, and that's what sort of led me to start to bleach these. This is cherry, which is normally quite dark red, but I bleached this like 7 or 8 times.
Well, it's a landscape. It's called Mesa Country. Often the mesas just erupt with sheer cliffs and at least for my mind, look cubical. And then they're juxtaposed here with these sort of swirling lines into which the cubes are grounded. It has about 600 meters of cord, 2 millimeter wax cotton, all knotted. The entire thing uses one knot called the double half hitch, about 20,000 times in this piece, roughly.
So the name of this is the turning point, which is really what was a significant change for me, because all my pieces before were very finely finished and highly polished and well sanded, and this one I kind of just let it go. Trying to explore different avenues as far as the textures. These are offset turning on the lathe, so you're getting on both sides and allowing the tool marks to show as well as the grain. The top part is on the table saw, and kind of the play between something that might be more hand done and hand sculpted using a lathe or a machine to something where it might be much more refined or tighter focused on the from the table saw. In addition, I also wanted to play with different finishes, and obviously you see the paint, milk paint, which kind of jumps out, certainly the different textures, as well as the different, just the play on the more finely finished cherry apron and rails.
Transitioning into really large work, which is what I just love doing, because it's a challenge to create something from a very small diameter material coming out, graduating into the larger diameters. So it's kind of the balance between fine detail and then getting into this big bold shape. But if you give it this convex surface, when you put things into a basket, it shifts, all the weight shifts down into here, so it won't bottom out. So it lends itself to beautiful design, but also a necessity of what has to happen with it.
This piece started with a photo, a macro photo of coral that was in a biology building through glass. So I printed it out on a 12 by 18 and then started drawing back into the photo because you lose most of your detail when you're printing on mulberry paper. So I draw into the image and then start layering it up with beeswax and Damar resin, and you have to fuse between every layer. So there's probably 12 or 15 layers in here. It's actually, I don't know if you felt it, but it's very solid. I mean, I wouldn't sit on it, but it's...
The idea of time, or the passage of time. You arrive at an object that, in a way, its time has passed, and now it has a new beginning in a way.
This is one of my sculptural, it gets categorized as basketry. It's polymer clay, it's coat hangers, it's electrical wire, there's less than $10 worth of material here. And I'm fascinated by things that have a value imbued in them because of the artist's vision with what to do with the material, rather than the material having an innate value.
I was born with a genetic hearing loss, and I started wearing hearing aids when I was 3 months old. My mother also has a hearing loss, my grandfather, and my 2 uncles. So I grew up with that, but I also grew up in a mainstream world where I do speech reading. I wear hearing aids that amplify sounds that I wouldn't be able to hear without them. So with this work, really what I want to do is create a bold, fashionable work that brings attention and awareness to deafness and hearing loss.
So the piece is a part of a series of felted biological forms, and the idea behind it is using felt and wool, which is typically a very soft and warm material, and using it in a way that has this sort of revolting, kind of very visceral, almost grotesque aspect to the form. So
I really fell in love with metal and what it can do and how you can make it be this really completely delicate thing that also has its own sense of body and stability. So when I start out a project like this, I start with a sketch, a drawing, and I love how so many people here have talked about sketches and its importance. I use that as my basic foundation, and it becomes an object on its own as I very meticulously hand cut all of the details with a jeweler's saw.
This piece is called Quenched, and it addresses how the plants satisfy our thirsts. And on it is represented all of the ancient beverages of the world. There's the tea plant here for tea. There's hops on it for beer. There's grapes for wine, and there are some bees for mead. And so I planted all of those plants in my yard because I use live specimens when I'm drawing it.
After I cut the pieces of wood, I sanded them, and then I used automotive spray lacquer. So I cast the silver, rolled it out, drew it into wire, and I'm reusing the fine silver. And the rest is copper and brass.
Thrilled and honored to introduce Mi-Kyung Lee. She's been our curator for making marks and has brought these artists together.
This has been several times I've been collaborating with the Wayne Art Center, and I really feel like this is one of the highlights of my career, that I be able to kind of, really looking at the what's happening in textile world. I hope that the viewers be able to see the making marks through colors and images and textures. Not only those are three components, but I think you can also see shadows or sounds. And I think many things could, possible.
Give you an idea of how I started working with beads. From the berries, I went to the beads, and the beads started out much larger than this, and they're now the absolute smallest beads I can get. Time, day and night, the passage of time, also dark and light, and the emotional significance of darkness and light.
Inspired by Albrecht Dürer's Four Witches, and I redrew the whole thing. And so I mostly work on 20 by 30 sheets of paper where I work in pen and ink or I work with gouache. I scan in my work and I digitally manipulate it in Photoshop, and then I digitally print it large scale on different substrates like fabric or sheer substrates.
For those of you who don't know my work, I've been cutting cloth into lace-like filigree patterns for the past 16 years. Sometimes the works are based on a kind of drawing, a freehand drawing, and sometimes they're very regimented in their structure. And oftentimes I'll look at historical textiles or textiles in our historical record.
All of my work uses thread and something discarded. And the work uses old envelopes, thrown away Tyvek envelopes. You know those ones you can't cut apart? I did. I learned to paint with them with the watercolor. I learned to just let them be.
Just the last 5 pieces I've done have been airport images, whether I'm layering the travelers, whether it's a group of travelers, but the linearity, the shine of the silk is what sucks me in. These are actually fused on, so I do a small, an 8.5 by 11 drawing always. I start with a photograph, and then I put it up on the wall and I can see the scale, what's going to work.
I mind the field of textiles all over the place. Look at Piper, we talked about this on the way up. So I've been and I have worked in things that I think are particularly American. So I've worked lots with the ideas of quilts, with rugs, and really familiar forms. And I've also, so So I'm looking at all these familiar forms, but then I will often interpret them in something not familiar.
Humanity, the face that we have, the life with the plastics, or in a way that kind of waste. So I like to kind of bring it those, but unfortunately we cannot not ignore, and kind of we live together. So that was in a way approach of this work. Knots to me was very important parts. And actually, woven, many of you are here as a textile or fiber people, and I think those joining part is very important, but these actually all are each singular piece. There's nothing, actually just really no woven. So everything is in a way composed with the knots.
And this is my work. This is actually a blanket that I unwove. If you know anything about weaving, there's the warp vertical threads and the weft. So I pulled out all the weft threads and left the warp. So you're sort of left with the skeletal system of the cloth of this blanket. It was my mom's blanket that she gave to me.
This piece is based on T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets, and they're segments of the poem. And it's about what you have to let go of in order to have this last section, which is so the darkness shall be the light and the stillness the dancing. But it talks about everything you have to let go of before that happens.